when I wrote The Absent Superpower, which was the shale-based book, I had a map that showed where all the world's petroleum-rich shales were, and they are all over the place. And the concern at that point was like the best shales that were in Europe were under population centers, whereas the best shales in the United States were in North Dakota and West Texas. So for us, they were proximate to population centers, so transport wasn't too big of an issue, but neither was annoying the neighbors. You're not going to frack at the Louvre. Now, you have an energy crisis, everyone goes back and reevaluates. The problem is, in the 10 years since that book came out, people have poked sticks in the ground to see whether this stuff is commercially viable or not. And in most cases, it's not. The shales are deeper, they're smaller, they're thinner, and they're not as petroleum dense. So if you took the amount of money that it's taken to get the United States where it is right now and spend exactly the same amount in Europe, assuming they have the cash, which they don't, you would probably only get 1/6 as much petroleum out. Now, necessity is the mother of invention, and when you're under pressure and the lights start going out, you will break your own rules in order to make sure that people don't starve in the dark. We're moving into a world where transport's going to be more difficult, and the inputs that allow for modern agriculture to happen on a global basis are going to be constrained. We're going to see that next year. Now, in the Western Hemisphere, I don't think this is going to be a really big issue, because let's say it completely destroys Brazil as an agricultural producer. I don't think it's going to be that bad. Brazil's still going to be able to feed itself. We won't have outmigration from Brazil. Most of Brazil's agricultural sales go to the Eastern Hemisphere. So this is an Eastern Hemispheric problem. And if you are in China or Southeast Asia, there are too big of mountains and too big of deserts and too big of jungles between you and anywhere you might walk. So you can remove East Asia from that math as well. What we're really talking about here is Central Asia and Africa. And all of those people would go to the Russian space and to the European space. And say what you will about the Europeans, they have been very creative with finding ways to stop those. So do I think it's going to be an ongoing issue? Yes. But I don't think it's going to define the politics of these countries. We go through phases where we're open and where we're close to migration. We're obviously in a more nativist period right now. The problem is that our electoral system strongly encourages big tent parties because we're first past the post, so you vote for a person rather than a party. So our parties tend to be weak, and that means they have to have as many factions within them in order to win office. Well, those factions move around based on issues in demographics and economics and geopolitics. And in the last 30 years, we've had a lot of change. The rise of globalization, the fall of globalization, the rise of China, the fall of China, the Ukraine war now, the information revolution. It makes sense that the factions are going to move around and we're going to treat our politics different. Well, the faction that right now is in the middle of a tug of war between the two parties is organized labor. And the issue that they care about the most is immigration. So no one at the national level for either party is going to breathe a word about immigration reform until such time as we know where organized labor lands. So we've got this wonderful opportunity right now to open the doors and bring in just scads of skilled labor from the world over. And we are incapable of doing that right now. I would guess that we won't be capable of having that conversation at a national level until 2028. And unfortunately, that's when a lot of this damage will already be felt by. In the past, our immigration policy was to pretend that we didn't have an immigration policy, but have a de facto open border to welcome in Mexicans. But Mexico started industrializing very seriously 30 years ago with the NAFTA Accords. And the birth rate halved as everybody moved into the towns to take the industrial jobs. So there's no longer a volume of Mexicans to come north. And then CAFTA was adopted 5 years later. So the Central American wave we're currently experiencing only has a few more years to run before that is gone too. And then everyone else that might come to the United States can't walk. They have to be on a ship or fly, which means they have to come from the Eastern Hemisphere. And that has to be a stated, firm, national policy, and that requires common response. So the demographic situation is the worst in world history. And the Chinese are in the process of updating their data. They're admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, all of whom would have been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago. So we're already looking at a demographic structure that's not even in decline. It's in full collapse, and there will not be enough people aged 40 and under in China by 2030 to maintain any version of any economic system that we have yet to dream up in our heads. We don't even have a theory for what this might look like. Closer to home, We expect the energy flows from the Russian space to be disrupted. The Chinese are the ones at the end of that chain, so they're probably going to have to suck up the entirety of the shortage. That is more than enough to trigger something far worse than the 1970s oil crises, but specifically for China. Third, Xi has become the strongest cult of personality in human history, and he's consolidated more power to himself than any human in history, including Caligula. It's impossible now for him to get information because people won't bring it to him because they're scared of what he'll do because they don't know whether or not it's going to make him happy or sad. So he's completely isolated. And so all he's doing basically is drinking Kool-Aid. He's drinking the Russian Kool-Aid and believing them on energy policy. He's drinking Chinese policy and he's believing China's propaganda on tech policy. And on COVID, we're seeing the whole thing starting to fall apart. What people forget about managing a system is it requires a lot of fingers and eyes. The American system is its noise. We have a federal government, state governments, local governments, a business community, a civic community, academic community, and the glory and the horror of the American system is how they rub against each other and clash. That noise that oftentimes Americans think of as a negative is actually a huge positive, because it means if one of them completely collapses, the others don't, and we still have a governing system that keeps the system moving forward. Well, China has one person. It's not even the CCP anymore. They've become a cult of personality. It's one guy. The policies stop with him. And even if he was the smartest human in history, and he was not willing to shoot the messenger regularly, which he is, there is just too much going on for one guy to manage, especially in a country with over 1 billion people. And so with this COVID thing now, we were seeing protests, large protests involving thousands of people in every major city. They conflate accurately opposition to the COVID policies with Xi. And so we're seeing the Winnie the Pooh with the black piece of paper protests. That's a real problem because every protest is automatically about Xi personally. And this is going to go one of two ways. Option A, the protests continue, they spin out of control because they're protesting now literally everything. And that is national dissolution. Option B, Xi reasserts control. And we get a lockdown that looks a lot more like Tiananmen than what we've seen so far at the same time that we've now had hundreds of super spreader events in the last 8 days. And the lockdowns they're going to have to do for COVID are going to look like what happened in Shanghai a couple months, but almost everywhere. Well, remember that the Chinese vaccines don't work at all against Omicron, so it's not just the old people that are in danger. We've seen a significant exodus out of the Chinese system since the last year of the Obama administration. It's accelerated every year for different reasons, but not everybody has started that process. Apple's by far the one that has been the slowest and is dragging its feet and has taken every example of trade disputes or genocides and just ignored them and doubled down, and now they're screwed. So what distinguishes Pax Americana from Pax Britannia and what came before is, unlike all of the Paxes of the past, the American period was not an empire. When you're an empire, you use your military force to force your way upon the world and extract economic concessions. You establish customs units, you skim off the top. The United States didn't do it that way because the United States wasn't interested in the economic side of dominating the world. We saw it as a security problem. At the end of World War II, we found ourselves facing down the Red Army a continent away, and we knew in order to contain it and beat it back that we needed to have a deep roster of allies who were willing to be cannon fodder in the case that there was a new war. And so we bribed them. We created globalization and used our Navy so that any of them could go anywhere at any time and interface with any partner and access any market. We basically paid them to be on our sides. In compensation, we got to write their security policies. And that is the Cold War order. That is the Bretton Woods system. That is the order, as I call it. And it lasted until the Soviet Union died. But then in 92, we voted down the guy who wanted to reform it. And we had a succession of ever more populist and isolationist leaders, culminating with Joe Biden. And now we have the most economically populist foreign policy that we have seen in this country in well over a century. And the Americans just are not holding up the ceiling anymore. We had a moment back with George Herbert Walker Bush. You remember 1,000 Points of Light in the New World Order, that conversation? where he tried to get us to have a national conversation about what we wanted out of the world now that the Cold War was over. What did we want to leave for our children? And we voted him out of office for trying to have that conversation. Without a serious overhaul, it was always going to fail, because when this was established in the 1940s, the United States was a larger economy than everyone else in the world put together by all meaningful measures. But year by year by year, as the United States basically encouraged everyone else to grow, we used our military capacity and our access to our market to underwrite the entire alliance. You do that for 75 years, and collectively the rest of the world got more powerful economically, to the point that the United States, even if it wanted to continue de facto subsidizing everything, couldn't. There's a military aspect. Post-Soviet period, we changed the way our Navy works. We concentrated all of our power in the super carriers. We don't have a lot of destroyers anymore. We couldn't patrol the global oceans now, even if we wanted to. And part of it is demographic. After 75 years of industrialization and urbanization, the very population structure of the world changed. And in most of the world now, especially in the advanced world, there are more people in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s, than their 20s, than their teens. And we now have such a top-heavy demographic that's full of people who are now on the verge of retirement, that there aren't enough people to sell to. The U.S. market is really the only one of size that still has a lot of young people. All those millennials that we keep maligning, they've got something going for them that their cohorts around the world don't. They exist. And there's no longer sufficient consumption on a global basis to support the productive capacity that's out there. So approach this strategically and militarily, or approach it demographically and economically. It doesn't have much time left. There are a lot of countries out there that have followed different demographic patterns. I mean, everybody has started living longer and everyone has had a lower birth rate, but there's a lot of variation within the themes. The Mexicans didn't start going through this transition until the 90s. The Germans started it before World War II. Some did it slow, some did it fast. I don't think there's much of a paradox here, because unless we did it as a planet all at the same rate, it's really hard to draw an ideological argument as to how we might have done it different or better. Problem is that once the birth rate started to drop, with like a half a dozen exceptions globally, none of them ever picked up. You urbanize, you have fewer kids. There are very few exceptions to that trend. The prominent one is in the United States, where we had the suburbs. Suburbs in the United States mean something different than suburbs in most other countries. In most other countries, the suburbs are slums. Here, single-family homes rule. And as if you have a yard, you can have more kids. So there's a cultural and a geographic element here that I think a lot of the ideologies that debate the consumption issue miss. And that's one of the reasons why the United States is actually reasonably well positioned here. Like I said, the millennials exist. There isn't the equivalent of the millennials in Britain or in Germany or in Italy or Korea or Japan or China. And for the next 40 years, that is going to make all the difference. I mean, we're not going to suffer nearly as much on the slide down as everyone else, because we're not dealing with the collapses in finance and consumption or military security that a lot of other places are. But at the same time, we're looking at, in the next few years, at the Chinese and the German systems dissolving as economic players. That means that if we want to have manufactured goods in North America, we have to build them here, which means we need to roughly double the size of the industrial plant. Will that be inflationary? Oh yeah. But it will also be the greatest economic growth story in the history of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Record growth is not something that scares me. Well, agriculture, manufacturing, those are ones that I think most people understand the concept that you can only do something good, certain things in certain places, that there's concentrations of activity. So if you change the balance of the game, where you do that moves around. So for example, in the agricultural sector, a lot of the fertilizer production comes from the former Soviet world. That's in the process of falling offline. So if you have a soil type like in Brazil that just requires more fertilizer in order to grow anything, you're in trouble. I think that plays to people's mental bandwidth. I think the more important issues are the things that kind of operate under the hood that we don't necessarily think of every day because we assume that there's no problem. Transport's a great example. The concept of being able to move anything at scale anywhere in the world at a very low cost, reliably, with no security cost whatsoever, historically speaking, that is a laughable concept, but it's indelibly woven into how we think of the world today. I mean, you only have to go back a century and a half to get to a period when it was cheaper to move things from London to Massachusetts as opposed to moving them from Massachusetts to New York on a road. And we're moving into a world where international transport is not going to be safe. And in that sort of a world, everything about our current manufacturing, energy, agriculture, everything else breaks down. And transport becomes a local and a regional concern instead of a national one. That forces a complete reimagining of how the world works. Same thing in finance. Piracy, state piracy, and privateering. All three of them I see coming back in a very big way. We're seeing piracy in places that are kind of in the no man's land between the major economic zones. So if you think today of the major zones as the Brazilian coast, the American coasts, the European system, the Chinese system, the Indian system, and the Persian Gulf system, those areas have negligible piracy at all. And we have very few zones that are in between where the rule of law on the sea exists, or where it doesn't exist. And that's where we see piracy. What I'm saying is that when you break down some of these bigger blocks and they can no longer function, and the writ of the state is no longer able to provide regional security, then we have more of those zones. And the more of them that we have, the more countries will have a vested interest in disrupting trade for their own reasons. I would argue that the country to watch the most robustly as the United States kind of backs away from things is India, because they're the first major country out of the Persian Gulf, and there is no way in hell they will let themselves have an energy crisis if they can avoid